Hi there. Have you ever seen a world champion stare at the board after the very first move? Not because it's strong, but because it's insulting. Because in 1980, English Grandmaster Tony Miles did exactly that to the reigning world champion Anatoly Karpov, and what followed became one of the most famous opening rebellions in chess history. This game was played in Skara, Sweden, and it starts with a move that looks so bad, so pointless, that most players would laugh it off. Karpov played as white, while Miles had the black pieces. So, white opens with pawn to e4, the most classical move in chess, immediately staking a claim in the center. And now comes the moment that stunned everyone. Black plays pawn to a6. This is the St. George defense, or rather what became the St. George defense after this game. At the time, this move was considered almost insulting. It doesn't fight the center, it doesn't develop a piece, it doesn't prepare castling, it just asks a question. What are you going to do about it? Now, it is crucial to note too that this game was actually played at a time when Karpov was considered extremely lethal with the white pieces, losing almost to no one. After the game, Miles actually did say that he had looked right at Karpov to try and read his expression, to see some sort of reaction, but Karpov gave off absolutely nothing, zero reaction to what he had played, and just went on with the game. He plays pawn to d4, grabbing the center immediately. This is exactly how you're taught to punish nonsense openings. Miles follows up with pawn to b5, and now it looks even worse. Two flank pawns pushed, zero central presence. To many spectators, this already looked like black was begging to be crushed. Karpov develops with knight to f3, eyeing the king side and preparing quick pressure. Very logical. Miles calmly plays bishop to b7, placing the bishop on the long diagonal. And here's the first subtle idea. That bishop is now staring straight at the center and the king side. It's not useless at all. Bishop to d3, reinforcing e4. Knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn and adding control to the center. Here, Karpov brings out the queen early to e2, supporting the e-pawn and keeping options flexible. Miles' response is pawn to e6, at last reinforcing the center and opening lines for his dark squared bishop. Now, white strikes on the queen side with pawn to a4, immediately questioning black's advanced structure. Miles doesn't retreat though, he counters with pawn to c5, challenging white's center from the side. This is important. Black is not trying to outmuscle white in the center, he's trying to undermine it. The idea is simple. If white overextends, those pawns can become targets. Karpov accepts the challenge and takes on c5, and Miles immediately recaptures with bishop takes c5, activating the piece and keeping pressure. White continues knight to d2, a flexible move connecting rooks and keeping options flexible for f3 or e4 squares. Black advances pawn to b4, expanding on the queen side and creating potential tactical ideas. White strikes in the center with pawn to e5, gaining space and pushing the knight. Black responds knight to d5, keeping his piece active and centralized. White jumps knight to e4. Black calmly retreats bishop to e7, preparing to castle and keeping the structure solid, and white simply castles. While black develops knight to c6, bringing the last minor piece into play, white plays bishop to d2, connecting rooks, and black moves queen to c7, eyeing multiple lines and subtly pressuring b2. Then comes a really interesting moment. White plays pawn to c4, trying to destabilize the knight, but black responds pawn takes c3 en passant, exploiting a rare opportunity and instantly shifting the pawn structure. White recaptures with the knight, but black immediately strikes knight takes c3, forcing white to respond bishop takes c3. Black jumps knight to b4, creating threats as it opens the long diagonal for the bishop and puts the knight on its best circuit, and white calmly eliminates it with bishop takes b4. Miles recaptures, keeping pieces balanced. Now, white decides to centralize the rook to c1, controlling the c-file and attacking the queen. The queen must move, so it goes to b6, directly targeting b2. White plays bishop to e4. Karpov at this point has noticed just how powerful that queen bishop is and wants to counteract it, while black finally castles, bringing his king to safety.
Karpov then plays knight to g5, aiming at f7, always a tempting weak point in black's camp. Now there was an interesting, almost tempting idea for white here. Bishop to h7 check. On the surface, it looks sharp, sacrificing the bishop to pull black's king out and launch an attack with knight to g5. If you're thinking like a fan of aggressive play, you might actually favor this move because it creates immediate threats and feels like white could take over the game. It's the kind of move that gets your heart racing if you enjoy tactical fireworks. But here's the thing. While it's tricky, Miles had calculated it carefully and was confident that Karpov would consider it too speculative to play. If white had gone for bishop to h7 check, the king would have to capture with king to h7, and then knight to g5 would threaten a quick attack. Black, however, has several defensive resources. For example, moving king to g6 keeps the king relatively safe, and a follow-up like queen to g4 can be met with pawn to f5, and suddenly the attack fizzles. Even some of the more forcing lines, like bringing rooks to h4 or moving the queen to g3, look sharp, but careful defense leaves white overextended. So while bishop to h7 check is tempting and arguably looks exciting for white, Karpov instead chose the safer knight to g5. Miles responds pawn to h6, asking the knight to decide. White goes bishop to h7 check, forcing king to h8, and then retreats bishop to b1, keeping it safe. Of course, black can't take the knight with the pawn here because that would just lead to mate in 2, with the queen supported by the bishop on b1. So black develops bishop to e7, coordinating and attacking that knight. White repositions the knight on e4, and now black brings his rook to c8, challenging white's rook for the open file. Here, Karpov chooses to create a battery with his queen and the bishop, which honestly looks threatening, but good as it may have been, it was only going to give him the edge if it got the chance to operate. However, Miles was never afraid of phantoms, and he reveals that white's threats are in reality empty.
He trades rooks, and then black grabs a pawn with queen takes b2 while also threatening the rook. White responds with rook to e1, which really isn't the best move, but black continues queen takes e5, gaining material while pinning the white knight to the rook. White's back rank is full of weaknesses at this point, and he has nothing else but to take a pawn back on d7, but black calmly replies bishop to b4. Now the rook is in danger, so white plays rook to e3. Black responds queen to d5, and after that move it is clear any traces of a white attack have completely vanished, and the world champion is faced with an inevitable conclusion in which his pieces lack coordination and he is material down. After the queen trades, white looks to eliminate one of the bishop pair with knight to c3. However, black has seen it all and pins the knight with his rook on c8. The liquidation has left the world champion in a terrible situation. He is a pawn down, his a-pawn remains weak, his opponent possesses the bishop pair in an open situation, and to cap it all, white has problems with his own back rank. The remainder of the game is a mere technical exercise for one of Miles' strength. White retreats knight to e2, and black pushes pawn to g5, starting kingside expansion. White challenges with pawn to h4, also finally creating a luft for the king. Black moves king to g7, exchange of pawns, and now white centralizes bishop to d3. Black pushes pawn to a5, rook to g3 looking to just try something, anything, but black advances king to f6, killing that dream. White continues rook to g4 at this point, desperate probably with the hopes of sacrificing the rook for the bishop and push the a-pawn. Black responds bishop to d6, again killing that path, while at the same time creating threats as the bishop now sees the only escape for the white king. White moves king to f1 and black plays bishop to e5, steadily improving positions. King to e1, rook to h8, signaling kingside pressure. White pushes pawn to f4, still with that same idea that after black captures with pawn, knight takes f4. If black recaptures, he could probably find counterplay with tempo on the black king. But Miles isn't giving him that chance. He retreats the bishop to c6, maintaining flexibility. White plays knight to e2, black gives rook to h1 check. White steps king to d2, black continues rook to h2, threatening to capture even more material, but white pushes pawn to g3, protecting the pawn. Black develops bishop to f3, eyeing the rook and the knight. The rook must move, and it goes to g8. Black plays rook to g2, king to e1, black simplifies with an exchange, and finally black can take the pawn on g3.
White plays rook to a8, attacking black's a-pawn, and black positions bishop to c7, leaving white with no realistic defense. And here, in this position, Karpov resigns.
Against a defense that shouldn't work, he had been completely outplayed. This game teaches a powerful lesson. Chess principles are guides, not chains. And sometimes, the move that looks ridiculous is the one your opponent understands the least. Before you go, let me know in the comments, at what moment did you realize Karpov was actually in trouble? Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, please support me by subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.